12th, 1994. Today's interview is with Mr. William J. Reynolds from El Paso, Texas. He's an ex-prisoner of war of the Germans during World War II. We will be discussing his experience as a prisoner of war. Mr. Reynolds, will you please begin by telling us where you lived and your occupation prior to enlistment?
I was born in El Paso, Texas, and lived here all my life.
What did you do before you joined the Army or before you were drafted?
I was not drafted. I was a volunteer, I'll have you know. And
when did you volunteer?
Well, I got my commission in 1942 while I was still in dental school. And then when I graduated in 1943, I went into active service as a first lieutenant in the dental corps.
Can you give us a brief outline of your military career prior to being captured?
Well, I went into the dental corps in Camp Barkley, Texas, and served there for a short time. Then I joined the 29th Field Hospital that had just come back from Kiska, from the Battle of Occupation of Kiska in the Aleutian Islands, and we reorganized, regrouped, and went to Europe, to the ETO. And I was with them in Scotland, Wales, and England, then into the continent. We took care of casualties from the D-Day invasion. I personally took care of 3 wounded paratroopers from that, as well as other casualties.
So even though you were in the dental corps, you were actually more of a medic then during this time period?
Well, we were in a field hospital, which is a support unit, I suppose you'd call it. And after we left England, we went into the continent through Omaha Beach, which was the main invasion point. But we went in after it was secured. Now, we weren't fighting soldiers. No, I was a non-combatant, you might say. But after we invaded there and went into France, we turned to the west. We bypassed Cherbourg and went on to capture Brest, which was one of the main submarine pens on the west coast of France. We surrounded it and just pounded the stuffings out of them from the air and from artillery and from everywhere. And after Brest fell, when we took Brest, our battle cry was Brest or bust, and we took it. Soon as Brest fell, we moved around to the south of it to surround some of the other Atlantic coast ports, which were serving as submarine bases. And I came to grief in outside of Lorient, France. That was just the next port south of Brest.
Can you tell me what were the circumstances that led to your capture?
Yes, we were out we were in new territory, and we were out on a detail making contacts for our unit to establish contact with commissary supplies, PX supplies, shower head. We were always looking for a shower head. We weren't big enough to have any of our own on these things, and we went around just making there's always all the support facilities and functions of the military, quartermaster and so on. We went around doing that, and somehow or other, I was not in charge of the detail, so I take no blame for it. We got off on a wrong road and ran into a German, I don't know whether it was a patrol or whether it was a checkpoint, possibly even. They had a landmine, or some landmines in the road, and we were in an ambulance doing all these errands. We ran over the landmine and blew up. I was thrown out of the vehicle and landed in the ditch on the side of the road, going about 30 miles an hour, and I went rolling down the hill, and when I finished rolling, I ended up on my feet, ready to run, I suppose, and I noticed that my right foot wasn't working. I sat down, I had 8 bones broken, and I had shock and shrapnel and blood, and I sat down and started hurting immediately. My foot was inside of a big combat boot, and it was pretty painful. And the next thing I knew, there were several Germans just standing right on top of me, aiming their Schmeissers at me. A Schmeisser was what they called their burp gun. It was an air-cooled high-frequency machine pistol, they called them, I guess. And just looking up at those little black holes in the end of their barrels was rather unnerving.
On what country and on what day were you captured?
We were in Brittany, France, in northwestern France.
And this was when?
This was October 28th, 1944.
How old were you at this time?
25 years old.
You were a little older than the average GI then.
Oh, yes. I still am.
You were captured by yourself then?
No, there were 3 of us in the ambulance.
The other one survived too?
The driver and the lieutenant in charge of the detail. And I was along just for the ride, really, because I was not in charge of the detail. And the other lieutenant had asked me to come along with him.
And you were a lieutenant at this time?
Yes, I was a first lieutenant.
During the moment that you, obviously you were in pain here, in shock, but if you can recall, after you looked at those gun barrels and you saw those Germans and you knew you were a prisoner, you knew you were captured. Can you recall what your inner thoughts were at that moment? Do you know what was going through your head? Can you recall?
Well, the lieutenant who was with me spoke German, so I suggested to him that he asked these guys to let us go, that we would be happy to just limp back to our lines the best we could, and that we were really non-combatants and of no danger to these Germans, but they said no. They said 9. And then they took the other 2 who apparently were not injured. They were dazed. They were walking around rather stupidly. They took them off, and I never saw them again. But since I was wounded and I was pretty bad shape, they went into the ambulance and took out a litter that that's part of the ambulance equipment. They took the litter out and put me on the litter and started to carry me off. And I said, well, wait a minute, before you carry me off, I have a camera in the ambulance. And so one of the soldiers, one of the Germans, went back to the ambulance, got my camera, and gave it to me. So I carried that thing with me through the rest of the time. I even lent it to the Germans, and they took some pictures.
Whatever happened to those pictures?
I don't know. They disappeared.
Did the camera disappear too?
Well, the camera was later disappeared when one of my brothers took it on his trip to Korea, and he lost it over there.
What kind of treatment did you receive immediately at the time of capture, let's say within your first 48 hours? For example,
Well,
like, did you receive medical treatments as you were injured? Were you interrogated?
No, right in the beginning, the Germans that picked me up were just field soldiers, infantry, I suppose, and they did have some morphine with them, and they could see that I was hurting. They took my shoe off, and they gave it to me. I mean, they put it on the litter with me, and they gave me a shot of morphine, which I thought was the best thing. I felt like they had rescued me, if nothing else. They didn't capture me, they rescued me. But then they carried me off through the shrubbery and through the hedge and on into a shelter that they had. It was an old house, a farmhouse, I suppose. And we went in there and spent the night. They gave me something to eat, and I wasn't able to eat much. I was hurting too much. And we stayed there overnight, and the next day they came in and suddenly we took off in a hurry, and they told me later that the American artillery had just leveled their house. So from there we moved around various places, and I ended up in a bunker.
No, you were still being carried on this litter.
Oh yeah, I never did get out of it. In fact, I think it's the litter that I was exchanged in. They carried me around. We ended up in this bunker, which is a concrete domed shelter that they were using as an aid station. The walls were lined with bunks, and I was put in with a bunch of wounded German soldiers. Some of them were not Germans, because as they went through Europe, they drafted everybody. There was, I remember, a big Russian with a head wound was in there, and he was in a German uniform. And then at another point, well, and there we also had a Dutchman, a Hollander, who had been in the Dutch Navy. He was in one of the Schnell boats, and the German Air Force had just shot them out of the ocean. You know, they did all their patrolling up and down the English Channel, and the Germans just wiped them out. And he was there. He had been wounded. All the occupants there were wounded. The ones that were ambulatory took care of the ones that were not ambulatory. Those of us that were flat on our backs just depended on these other guys. There was this big Russian. I remember him especially because he had a head wound and he could walk, and he'd go outside, and they'd let him have the run of the area apparently, because he would frequently come back with a bottle of Calvados, which he would share with the rest of us.
Now, what was this place? Was this, this obviously was not a camp. Was this a small village, or?
It was populated area. I'm not sure it was inside of a village or maybe in the outskirts of Lorient. I never was totally oriented because...
But this was, you were actually inside a building.
Well, at this point, yeah. See, at first we went to this little farmhouse, and then we went to this other place. I think they were moving around because they were trying to stay alive.
It was the latter part of the war, right?
And we ended up in this bunker, which was a domed concrete shelter, and that was absolutely safe. We could hear the American artillery. We could hear small arms fire, you know, sporadically, and they would take me outside on a pretty day to sun me. You know, we would all go outside and just kind of sit there on the shady side of it.
Mm-hmm.
By shady, I mean away from the American Army. We would go out and just sit there and enjoy the fresh air. But if the artillery started getting close, we would all go inside, and it was like going in out of the rain, perfectly safe.
Besides morphine, you said they administered to you. Did you ever receive any medical treatment for your wounds?
Well, that was after that. I mean, this was all very first aid at that point. After I'd been there a few days, they transferred me to a French hospital that the Germans had taken over, and there they did debride me, which means they trimmed off the torn skin and flesh and kind of cleaned me up a little bit. And at that point I was still bleeding. I'd been bleeding for about for over a week, I know, and they wouldn't stop. They gave me some heparin, I think, or one of those blood clotting agents, and it stopped. And then after that, they bandaged me up good and put a kind of a splint on me. But before that, it had just been kind of paper bandages because I was so messy. And they didn't have anything else much. We ate a bowl of kind of a gruel, a very thin barley soup for breakfast. It would be about like a coarse cream of wheat, very watery, That was breakfast in a bowl. And I got the same, I was fed out of the same bucket that the other wounded soldiers were. The mess detail would come in with a bucket, and they would scoop us out a bowl, and then at noon they would give us some cabbage soup, and usually some more cabbage soup in the evening, and sometimes they would give us a piece of bread, black bread, and at night, as a special treat, they would smear a little lard on it. They called it schmaltz, and that made it really much better than dry, you know. But that was the diet.
Right. Let me ask you, from what you talk, you were never really taken to a prison camp, right?
No, I was never in a prison camp. No, I was never out of my bunker. I mean, never out of my litter. I was flat on my back the whole time. They just carried me around.
So how many places did they carry you to altogether?
Well, I just remember 3 where we made any kind of a stop. And then I remember also that we did some moving and just without actually making any permanent camp.
Did they ever interrogate you?
Yes, they did take me one time to another bunker where this German officer who spoke English asked me if I knew any military information. And I said no. And he asked me what unit I was with. And I said, well, I'm not supposed to tell you that. I'm not supposed to tell you anything. And he said, well, you don't really need to. It was written on the bumper of your ambulance where we captured you, so we know where you were. We know you were from the 29th Field Hospital. And I said, yeah, I know. But you know the rules, don't you? I said, I told him that. And then after a while, we got to just chatting. And he said, well, he kind of quit trying to prod me. And I said, no, well, you know, the only military information that I know is what I read in the newspapers or hear over the radio, but they don't tell me anything. And I told him, he told me that what we should be doing is getting together with the Germans and fighting the Russians. He said, they're our real enemy. They're our mutual enemy, and you'll wish we had sometime or someday. And I said, well, that may be, but I'm not in a policy-making position, and there isn't. I just do what I'm told. And then it got to be just a conversation. And I finally told him, the last military news I heard was that Aachen is kaput. You know, Aachen had just fallen. Aachen was the first German city that fell in this war. And it upset those people something terrible. It's just like somebody capturing somewhere in Los Angeles or New Jersey, and you know, just it it was a morale blow to the Germans. And I said, when I told him Aachen is kaput, he got kind of huffy, and he said, okay, and closed off the interview. And they sent me back to the bunker where I was, where the medics took care of me.
How long were you a POW?
20 days,
20 days.
yeah. And then we had this exchange, and they exchanged me. Did you get any of the data from that? That might be a nice little blurb to add to it from that.
Obviously, you know, there's a lot of questions that would not apply, so you kind of have to, 20 days, and you kind of have to tell me, fill in as much as you can on those 20 days experience. You know, for example, like this, interviews, you know, eating, that kind of stuff, you know. Since you were never really you were a POW, you were never held in the POW camp. And then I'd like you to go into this exchange, because there's very few men that were actually exchanged, if you're not aware of that. And even some of the guys that were captured at the end were taken to some of the POW camps and then became transient POWs until they were either liberated by an army. So if you can fill in a little bit of that and then kind of go into this exchange.
Well, toward the last few days that I was with the Germans, I was in this French hospital, and a lieutenant, an Oberleutnant Schmidt, little short guy, came in, and he told us that he was working on an exchange. And we thought, boy, that's great. There were 3 American prisoners, 3 American lieutenants in the room with us in this hospital. There were 3 of us, and that was the only ones of us who were in this hospital that were American, as far as I know. And he came and told us the good news, and we just thought that was great. And he came in 2 or 3 times just to tell us about it. So we knew a few days in advance that this was coming. In that hospital, we had an orderly who came and ministered to us as patients. He'd bring us food and bring us bedpans and, you know, what they do in a hospital. Take our temperature. Who was a Russian Cossack. He was really a Ukrainian, but he had been a Cossack. And he was an Oriental-looking fellow, a little short, stocky guy with muscles on his muscles. And they had captured him on the Eastern Front, and he couldn't speak much of anything except Russian. But we managed to get some communication with him, and we did gather that he didn't like the Russians, and he didn't like the Germans too well. He was from the Ukraine, from the Ukraina. But that's just a kind of a little side thing. When we were actually exchanged, they put the day of the exchange, they came in and gave us a very good breakfast, very early in the morning, before daylight. They gave us some shellfish, I remember. You know, I don't know, they might have been little small clams or something like that, and I thought they were delicious. It was the first thing I'd eaten since I was captured. There wasn't cabbage soup or barley soup. Oh, the other thing they had was this coffee. This coffee was parched barley. You know, they would roast barley until it turned black, and then they would steep it in water and give you a kind of a brown liquid. But they gave us this very nice breakfast, And one of the Germans, by that time I was looking pretty scruffy. I had a 3-week growth of beard, and this German lent me a razor. So I cleaned up, and if you can see in that picture, I was clean shaven. So they wanted us to look good. Then they put us in this ambulance, and I remember we were in the back of the ambulance, and it was elegant. It had windows on the sides. I think it must have been a hearse, really, rather than an ambulance, because it had nice big windows on the sides, and they were beveled glass. I mean, it was fairly elegant. The three of us were put in there, flat on our backs in our litters, and we were taken to this exchange point. I have no idea how we got there. We got there.
Do you know where it was?
No, I was totally disoriented because even after I was in American hands, they transferred me around in an ambulance, and it was like being shipped around in a box. I didn't know whether I was going up or down or sideways. But we went to this exchange point, and of course the American delegation came and the German delegation, and they were all in dress uniforms, and they had the little formalities, and this went on, and we looked out the windows of this hearse that we were in, observing the whole thing, and the American delegation was a bunch of American officers, I'd say from about Lieutenant Colonel on up, and there wasn't a man in that crowd that wasn't well over 6 feet tall. I mean, that was a hand-picked group. They looked like they were anywhere from about 6'2" to 6'6", and they were big, good-looking guys. And the German delegation, we had them surrounded, and they were, you know, the remnants of their army, and they were a bunch of little guys about 5'2" and 5'4", and they were standing there as straight as they could, but these guys, they didn't come up to here on the Americans. And I know that that was planned that way, because it wasn't just an American delegation of like you 6 guys or whoever coming. We're going to go on this exchange detail. They were big, strapping, good-looking beasts, and the poor Germans just little short, dumpy guys, and I think they did that just to humiliate them a little bit. But anyway, they went through the ceremonies, and we waited and waited and waited, and this went on, you know. Ceremonies always take too long.
When you mean ceremony, I mean, what exactly were there? Like, were they ironing out details about this?
I would say so.
Or was it just ceremonial, pompous type?
Well, some of it we thought was a little pompous type, and a little bit of military, almost like what do you call it? The presenting of the colors, and they came up and they had the exchange of military courtesies, and
what do you know about this exchange system as far as, I guess I'll give you a good idea. Like I say, this happened actually very infrequently it's actually happening very infrequently in most wars. It was very common during the Civil War. and there were a variety of type of exchanges, exchanges that were any type from a value of man to man, didn't make difference on rank, to exchange systems where there were values applied to rank. For example, like 10 privates for a captain or whatever. Do you know any details of the exchange?
No, I don't. I do know that they used to have exchanges quite frequently in previous wars, but they did not have very many in this war. That I was not really aware of any others other than this one.
You're the first person that I've interviewed that was actually held for a relative short period of time, and it was actually exchanged. Because most, even if they were injured, even at the end of the war, they were usually taken to a camp.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was a little surprised.
No, we were exchanged partly because we had the Germans surrounded in that area. See, this was on the west coast of France, and we had cut them off. The main body of German troops retreated eastward into Germany and across to the other side of France. And so there we had them backed up against the Atlantic Ocean, and that, I think, is what made the exchange possible.
Under the circumstance, did you feel lucky that you weren't actually just killed, knowing the circumstances, where this guy would have said, hey, we ain't got nothing to lose, we're going to shoot this guy and we're going to try to escape as much as we can?
Well, no, these Germans were, I thought they were just ordinary people. They were not SS troopers. Most of these guys were service troops that I was with, except for the ones that captured me. And even they were not fanatical fighting types.
Right.
But anyhow, getting back to this exchange, we sat there, or we laid there in this ambulance, what seemed to us like the better part of the day, and we were beginning to have bladder problems. It was awful. We were just about to lose our minds, the three of us there, and finally I pulled my boot out that I had, the one that I wore on my wounded foot and ankle. I pulled I still had it with me, so I pulled that thing out, and we used that as a urinal, and we'd hand it to the guard outside, and he would empty it and hand it back into us, and we would use it again. And I brought that thing home, and for many years I had it in a closet at home, bullet holes and shrapnel holes in it, and but I don't know what happened to that. You lose these things. You move from one place to another, and
Can you go ahead and just elaborate a little bit about the actual exchange when you were given back to the American forces, and then what happened afterwards as far as where you were taken?
Well, the actual exchange then took place symbolically, I would say, across a river. It was a small river, but this picture here shows you, they put us on this little French schooner and took us across and unloaded us, and they would load Germans on the boat and take them back. I mean, a boatload of Germans coming this way and a boatload of Americans going the other way.
As part of this exchange system, did you sign any official exchange forms? I mean, for example, like in the Civil War, you actually had to sign an exchange form and or a parole, for example, that
you wouldn't
that you were being exchanged and
you wouldn't bear arms.
You would not go to bear arms against them. Did you sign any kind of form?
No. No, but shortly after the exchange, I was taken to the 49th Field Hospital, where I was debriefed, or they called it exchange processing or debriefing or whatever. Um, you know how military people talk. And I was interviewed again, and at that time I did have to sign a form, a paper. Are you running out of time?
No. I was looking at the, go ahead.
Oh, I had to sign a form, but this was after I was in American hands. The Germans never made me do anything. Nothing there at all. They didn't care. They knew I was harmless. First of all, I was a non-combatant to start with, and second of all, I was rendered pretty helpless. So they didn't care what happened to me. They just wished me well and told me goodbye. But the Americans did exchange me. I mean, did interview me, and then they made me sign a form that I would not repeat any of this. This was all strictly confidential, top secret, what all, and that was that. Then I went through various stages after I was exchanged. I went to the 49th Field Hospital, where they kind of passed me on. I was there a couple of days, and then they passed me on to a general hospital in Rennes, France, where I spent 2 or 3 days, and where I got my Purple Heart. And the Purple Heart the ceremony was this guy came into the ward where there were a whole row of us, and he said, "Here's your Purple Hearts," like that.
Just threw them to you.
Yeah, kind of threw them on the beds to us, and we looked at them and opened up the boxes, and we were real pleased and proud and all that. But that was the ceremony. From there we went to Cherbourg, which had now been captured, and we had taken over a hospital there, and I was put in a little hospital there for holding purposes, really. I was only there 1 day or 2 days, and then they took us and put us on a boat, put me on a boat. By this time I was by myself. I never saw the other guys again. None of them. I was by myself. Went to Cherbourg is a port on the Channel, on the north coast of France, on the end of a little peninsula. And they put us on a small ship which was full of evacuee soldiers going back to England, and I was the only wounded one in the whole bunch. The rest of them had frozen feet, had trench foot and frostbite and that type of stuff from fighting over on the over in the German border, and where it must have been much colder than where we were. But we went over from there to Southampton. Then they put us in a railroad train. I was still in a litter, and they had racks on the side of these freight cars, and they just put the litter, hang you on there. Took me up to Sudbury, near Derby, just outside of Derby. It's a little suburb of Derby. The town was Sudbury, where they had an American hospital. It was a military hospital, one of these temporary things, and I spent the rest of the time there. till they had space available for shipping us back to the States. And these troop transports would go across the ocean full of troops and then come back empty, or come back with a bunch of woundeds that would bring us back in those things. And we came back across the ocean from out of Liverpool. And so from Southampton to Sudbury, and from Sudbury to Liverpool, I was transported in the freight car in one thing, and just like traveling in a box. From the other, I went in an ambulance, and that was a smaller box. And when I got to Liverpool, they took me straight to the boat, and I never saw anything. I was inside the box all the time.
All the way to the States.
Well, then I was put in this boat. We were coming back. The boat was coming back, you might say, essentially empty, but they did have a bunch of wounded soldiers to come back, as many as they could handle with the personnel there to take care of them. See, they were not equipped to take care of a boatload of woundeds. We did have some German wounded with us, prisoners that were coming back. But they told us that we'd be back in New York in 5 days. Well, 10 days later, we were still at sea because we got caught in a storm in the North Atlantic, and that boat rocked and rolled and heaved, and all the dishes broke, from sliding off the shelves and off the tables, and we had seasick sailors and seasick woundeds, and it was a mess. And one of the German wounded died. So they had decided to have a burial at sea. They didn't know what to do with him. They had no facilities apparently to keep the body. So they put him in a body bag, and they rigged up a board platform, and decided that they would have a little ceremony. And I thought, I've got to see this. So I got out of bed, or out of my little shelf, or what do you call it, my little bunk, and got some crutches, and fought my way to the deck. And we gathered there around this body, and I remember the guy said a couple of little prayers, and he said, "And the body shall be cast into the sea." In The Sea Wolf. Did you ever read The Sea Wolf? Well, he closed with that little quotation, and they lifted the thing up, and the guy slid off into this gray, heaving ocean like that, and I thought that was the saddest funeral I have ever seen. He just went whoomp and disappeared. I hope they kept a record of his name and address and all that to report back to his family. And then when we got to New York, the Statue of Liberty was, like the angel at the gates of heaven.
How'd you make it back home? I mean, I'm assuming that you were released afterwards, after you got better?
Well, we went to O'Halloran General Hospital in New York, somewhere in the New York area, from the boat. Still, that was another thing. All this was done in ambulances and, like traveling in a box. Got there, and they put me in a bed there. Then they asked me, you have a choice. We're going to try to send you home, close to home, and we'll put you as close as we can. What state are you from? And I said, Texas. And they said, well, we can put you either in Arkansas, which is right next to Texas, or in New Mexico, which is next to Texas, or in Texas. And I said, look, and they said, just put down your first, second, and third choice. And I said, my first choice is William Beaumont Army Hospital in El Paso. And they said, oh no, you can't do that. We can't do that for you. And I said, well, like hell you can't. I wrote down first choice, William Beaumont Army Hospital. Second choice, William Beaumont Hospital. Third choice. And they said, you can't do that, you can't do that. And I said, well, I already did it. And so they knew that I was going to be difficult. So they said, all right, all right. So they sent me to William Beaumont Army Hospital. But it took us several days to get across the country because we were low priority. We got off on side tracks, what do they call them, sidings, to let the important stuff going to the front, materiel and troops and all that, to the war effort. And we'd sit there on these sidings for hours at a time, then we'd get back on and travel on to, well, we say maybe we were in Indiana or Ohio, and then we'd stop, and then we'd stop some more. Then we'd, I think we did get through Kansas City at one point. And then after that, sailing was a little better because we got on that road from Kansas City down here to El Paso. And when we got down to El Paso, the railroad runs down through that, well, you're not from here.
Yes, I'm from here.
Oh, well then you know that the railroad comes in from Alamogordo and on down through here, and it goes down between the, down in that trough with Fort Bliss on one side and the east side, you know,
Right.
Sunset Heights. I mean, we pulled off on a siding down here just under the Officers Club. You know where that is, up on the mesa.
Right.
And we could look out one window of the train and see the Officers Club, and look out, and Fort Bliss, and look out the other way and look up at El Paso, and then up on the side of the hill was Beaumont Hospital. And there we were. We spent the day there, going crazy. They wouldn't let us off, and besides that, if I'd gone out, I'd have crawled. I couldn't do anything except I don't think I could have crawled away from there. I was so sick. But we finally got down to the Union Depot. They loaded us in ambulances and brought us back up to Beaumont Hospital. And I thought by the time I got there I was going to lose my mind. You know, it wasn't so bad when I was off in the rest of the country, but that last horrible day, after I was already here, I was not here. And then I got up to Beaumont Hospital.
Okay, my name is Fred.